Welcome to the lesson on sentence patterns 5 and 6, DC, S and SDC. But first, let's review. What should you have for every sentence in every single sentence pattern? That's right, you know this. First of all, you got to have a subject. That's who or what is doing the action. And then you have to have a verb. That would be the action of your subject. And finally, you got to have a complete thought. Can you say it to Uncle Joe by itself and he have a clue what you're talking about? So let's review our first sentence patterns that we learned. First, we learned S, FBS. That's where you've got a sentence, a comma, one of the fanboys, and another sentence. You remember those fanboys, right? Boring, orbital yet so. The next sentence pattern that we learned was S, S. That's where you have a sentence, a semicolon, and a sentence. There is only one rule, and that is that the sentences must be related. You're going to use this sentence pattern in place of S, S because it doesn't even really exist. The next sentence pattern that we learned was S, S. That's where you have a sentence followed by a semicolon, one of our connecting adverbs, another comma, and then another sentence. The connecting adverbs connect your sentences by describing how, when, where, why, and how much your sentences are related. Some example connecting adverbs would be things like weeping and gnashing of teeth, 5 minutes later, in the kitchen, furthermore, and however. Today, we're going to be learning two sentence patterns, DC, S and SDC. Let's start with the DC, S. That's where you're going to start with what's called a dependent clause, add a comma, and put a sentence. Or you can flip it around backwards and have a sentence and simply follow it by a dependent clause with no comma. So hopefully you can clue in what's different between a DC, S and a SDC. Not much at all. These, my friends, are your flipping sentence patterns. If you take a DC, S and flip it around to an SDC, you pretty much have the same sentence, but the first one has a comma and the second one doesn't. This makes sense because we learned in earlier sentence patterns that if you introduce anything, your sentence with anything, you need a comma after it. So if you introduce your sentence with a dependent clause, that's why you have your comma. So what is a dependent clause? A dependent DC stands for dependent clause, and a dependent clause has three things. Let's look at an example and figure out what these three things are. Because someone planted a tree long ago. So what do you notice? Someone planted should look familiar because somebody, literally someone, is doing something. That's right. The first two things that your dependent clause has to have would be a subject because your someone is doing something, and a verb because someone planted. So what is that third thing? Because someone planted a tree long ago. If you said this to Uncle Joe, would he understand what you were talking about? Nope. The third element of a dependent clause makes it not make sense. The word that makes it not make sense by itself is our trouble. Notice what happens if we take the word because away. Then we have someone planted a tree long ago. If you said that to Uncle Joe, he'd be like, awesome, I love trees. Because without the word because, you have a sentence. Someone planted a tree long ago. So, the word because makes it not make sense. Therefore, we're going to call it a nonsense word. The nonsense word makes it depend on the rest of a sentence to make sense. So the third thing that we have in a dependent clause is a nonsense word. The real word is called subordinated conjunction, but who really cares? Let me put this in an entire sentence for you and make it make a little bit more sense. Warren Buffett once said, someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree long ago. This, my friends, is an SDC. If you look carefully, you'll see that someone is sitting in the shade today is a sentence. Because is our nonsense word. Someone is our subject. Planted is our verb. Because someone planted a tree long ago is our entire DC. Remember, a DC starts with a nonsense word and has a subject and a verb. So our entire SDC is someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree long ago. Good job, Mr. Buffett. That's a rather nice SDC. Now, notice that because SDC and DC, S are your flippin' sentence patterns. Instead of saying someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree long ago, Mr. Buffett could have said, because someone planted a tree long ago, someone is sitting in the shade today. All you have to do is flip it around and add your comma. Speaking of nonsense words, you can't write a DC, S or an SDC without recognizing your nonsense words. So I'm about to give you a few here. Yeah, this is really about to happen. And you're going to dig it like you borrowed your granddaddy's shovel. After all those, subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. As if. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. As soon as though. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. Because, before. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. Even if, even though. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. How, if. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. Since, so far as. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. So that, unless. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. Until, when. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. Whenever, where. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. Whereas, wherever. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. Whether, while. Subject, a verb, and a nonsense word. That's right. These are your nonsense words. They're not all the nonsense words in the world, but it's plenty enough for you to start to being aware of when you were writing an SDC and a DC, S. So here are a few examples that you might be familiar with. Let's start with a couple of DC, S's. Florida Georgia Line once said, if it's meant to be, it'll be. If is our nonsense word. It's meant is our subject and our verb. So if it's meant to be is our dependent clause. It will be is our sentence all by itself. Here's you another one. The Beatles once said, when I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom. And then they added a simple sentence on there. Let it be. When is our nonsense word. I find is my subject and my verb. So when I find myself in times of trouble is my entire dependent clause. Mother Mary comes to me speaking words of wisdom is my sentence, and hence there's my DC, S. Let's take a look at some SDCs where we begin with our sentence and then follow it up with our dependent clause. Vanilla Ice once said back in the day when I was in high school, I go crazy when I hear a cymbal and a hi-hat with a souped up tempo. I go crazy is our sentence. When is our nonsense word, and I hear is our subject and a verb. So when I hear a cymbal and a hi-hat with a souped up tempo is my entire dependent clause. How about, I like myself better when I'm with you? That's an SDC. I like myself better is my sentence. When is my nonsense word? I am is my subject and a verb. Or you can even stack your DCs like pancakes if you want to. Green Day does it when they say, no time to search the world around is my sentence. Cause you know is my nonsense word, subject, and a verb. Where I'll be found is my nonsense word, subject, and a verb. And when I come around is my nonsense word and my subject and a verb. So you can write a SDC, if you like. Using a dependent clause is an easy alternative to having too many simple sentences or back-to-back sentence patterns in your writing, such as, imagine how choppy it would be if you heard you should clap along. You may feel like you are a room without a roof. Instead, we have clap along if you feel, which is our dependent clause, like you're a room without a roof. Much better in the song, right? So here's another example that illustrates how dependent clause allows for better flow in your writing. Instead of saying a man loves a woman, period, he can't keep his mind on nothing else. We have when a man loves a woman, because when is our nonsense word. A man loves is our subject and a verb. He can't keep his mind on nothing else is our sentence. It just allows for better flow. So remember, a dependent clause is made up of three things. That's your subject, your verb, and your nonsense word. So now that you can order your sentence pattern any way you want, you can start with a DC, S, or you can make an SDC. Now that you know 6 ways to vary your sentence structure in your writing, you know what's going to happen when you do. You'll have better variety, which will lead to better flow, which will lead to better writing. And that, my friends, is our goal. Thanks for watching. We have one more sentence pattern and 3 different ways to write it called P, S coming up next.